This is my charge controller. I got 3 of these huge charge controllers for the new solar panels that will go on the front of the boat. YouTube really isn't that big on unboxings anymore, so I've sped this part up. I got this little remote that makes it easier to program for my lithium batteries. Thermal probe. They're offered in different amp ratings. And they all look the same in the picture on the internet. And so, since I have several here, different sizes, I thought I would show them. This one is a 30 amp. And as you can see, it's just, this one's a 40. And so the 30 is just a little bit smaller than the 40. And this one is a 60. And proportionally, it's a lot bigger. I think the limiting factor on these is the area of the heat sink on the back. It has fins. Black on black doesn't show up so good, but hopefully you can see it on one of these. And the fins are definitely a lot deeper on the 60 amp. It has inputs for the battery and also for the solar panel. So the plan goes like this. The charge controller gets raised up a bit and some 2x4s go underneath, making a duct to allow airflow underneath the heat sink. And then at the top of the duct, I have these. So the plan with the fan is it goes up here. This is lumber for the duct that has been painted with fiberglass resin. It makes it really nice and shiny. And this is my inverter. I had to get a new inverter for 24 volts because the one from my 12 volt system wouldn't work. I won't be using that on-off switch because the inverter will be located where it's easy to reach. If all else fails, there's a manual. It has outputs for 110 volts as well as sockets for 110, a display that shows the battery voltage, some USB charge ports, and an on-off switch. In the back is 2 cooling fans, as well as the inputs for 24 volt DC. And here it is screwed to the wall. I'm going to have to move it in order to wire this charge controller, but then it can be put back more or less permanently. Everything from here down is going to be taken up by the freezer and the microwave on top of that. And there's a little room up above the inverter for a smaller backup inverter to run the freezer in case this one breaks for some reason. And here are the ducts in place, and that's how the fan will sit at the top of the duct above the charge controller. And there will be one above each charge controller. Now I'm measuring the cable, the length to go from the charge controller to the bus bars in the battery. And I'm basically taking cable off of the spool and routing it where I want it to go, way over to the side and then way to the back underneath and then to the bus bars. And once I know the length of the cable that I want, I can mark it. And this is 4-gauge cable. There's fatter cable like double O gauge going to the inverter, but this is still so fat that a wire cutter won't cut it. I'm using this bolt cutters to cut this. This tool would probably cut through a padlock if someone strong enough was working it. Even this wire, the 4-gauge, is almost the diameter of my little finger. The 00 gauge that goes to the inverter is actually
all the way around.
Actually as thick as my thumb. So I'm stripping the end, the insulation off the end, and then I have to install lugs on each end of the cable. And I'm using this hydraulic crimper. There's the lug held by the die. And now I'm going to put my wire in, making sure not to leave any little pieces hanging out, little strands. Okay, that's still on. So as I start to pump now, the die is being closed and it's starting to crimp the wire, and it gets noticeably harder to pump. And now I don't have to hold the wire anymore because it's being gripped there. And what I'm looking for now is where the two jaws of the die are coming together. I want to pump, but I want to stop pumping just before those are like right together. Alright. Takes a lot of force to do that. So now I can turn this to off and the piston will retract. And then I can just open the die. And there's my part crimped. That looks like a good crimp. So heat shrink comes in rolls like this. And you just take the length that you need. Get the scissors, cut it off the roll. You open the piece up so that it's round instead of flat. And then you take a heat gun and you heat it up. And amazingly, the heat shrink will shrink when you apply heat. So each positive input has a short piece of wire like this with a lug on it, and that'll be used to attach to a circuit breaker, and then a much longer piece of wire with a lug at each end will connect to the circuit breaker and then the battery's bus bar at the opposite end.
Fuck.
So this is the circuit breaker. It has like a bolt to connect to, and the lug goes there. A nut goes on the bolt. Like that. And here's the negative cable that has a stripped end that goes in the charge controller and a lug at the other end for the battery. And here's the other circuit breaker. This goes on the wires that go from the solar panels to the charge controller. So there's two circuit breakers, one where power goes in from the panels and the other where it connects to the batteries going out. And all the wires coming out of the charge controller to the battery are going to be routed along this side and down underneath what will be the countertop. And there still needs to be some straightening up of cables underneath here. But that's where they connect to the bus bars for the batteries. And this charge controller, this little one, is connected to 4 of the solar panels, is the only thing charging the batteries, and this other small one is connected to the other 2 panels on the rack and charges a 12-volt battery that can run the dinghy winch and the anchor windlass and any other 12-volt stuff. So that's the charge controller. That's the backup charge controller and the circuit breaker that I can use to basically turn it on and off if I need it. That big switch turns off the big inverter, and this is the circuit breaker for the big inverter. And the cables need to be tied down a bit more so they're not interfering with the operation of that breaker. So the wires that come from the solar panels to the charge controllers get run along the ceiling and out through here. And actually this raised up part of the ceiling is the rear part of this sofa. And where the wires are going is into this other leg of the sofa. And I installed a deck hatch here so I can access this space, which was really just wasted space before. But now it's a housing where I can put 3 sets of bus bars, which connects through these wires to each of the 3 inverters, and there'll be 3 strings of solar panels on the new solar panel rack that will also be routed underneath here to connect to the bus bars. And that yellow thing is a new table that I built to cover the space where the new air conditioner is.